Attorney General Pam Bondi announced a short time ago Maduro and his wife have been indicted in federal court on charges including narco-terrorism. There will be more details this morning at a news conference at Mar-a-Lago. We've got Natalie Brand traveling with the president in Florida with the latest. Natalie, good morning.
Good morning, Michael and Adriana. U.S. officials tell CBS News that Maduro was captured by the U.S. military's elite Delta Force. President Trump on social media early this morning confirmed what he called a large-scale and successful strike. Videos posted to social media show the scenes from Venezuela as explosions were reported at 2 a.m. local time in the capital of Caracas. U.S. officials tell CBS News President Trump ordered strikes on sites inside the country early Saturday morning, including military facilities. In a statement, the Venezuelan government said it, quote, repudiates and denounces to the international community the very serious military aggression by the U.S. government. Ahead of the strikes, President Nicolas Maduro told state TV he's open to talking to the U.S. on drug trafficking, oil, and migration issues. The Trump administration has accused Maduro of being aligned with drug cartels and gangs designated by the U.S. as terrorist organizations. The Trump administration has spent months ramping up pressure on the Maduro regime. Last month, President Trump ordered a blockade of sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. The massive military buildup of 15,000 American troops in the Caribbean includes 11 Navy ships led by the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier. Marines aboard the USS Iwo Jima have been conducting live-fire exercises, and stealth fighter jets have been deployed to Puerto Rico. On Monday, President Trump confirmed the first known U.S. strike inside Venezuela, saying an alleged drug-related site was targeted.
They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area.
But he did not confirm reports that the CIA carried out that strike.
Well, I don't want to say that. I know exactly who it was, but I don't want to say who it was.
This week, there were also more deadly strikes on alleged drug boats off the coast of Venezuela. That brought the total to more than 30 strikes on vessels, killing at least 115. For weeks, Democratic lawmakers and even some Republicans have questioned the strategy.
It's a completely made up and false sense that we're at war, we can do whatever we want, but if Congress wants to vote on it, no, we're not at war.
And lawmakers on Capitol Hill, even allies of the president, have said they want more information from the administration about what comes next and the end game. Senator Mike Lee of Utah New this morning on social media posted that he had a conversation with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who told him Maduro was arrested to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States and that the military action was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant overnight. We are expecting to hear many more details from the president himself. A news conference is scheduled for 11 a.m. Eastern at Mar-a-Lago. Michael.
And we will be keeping tabs on that. Natalie in West Palm Beach, thank you. Well, here's a closer look at Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela's leader has been in power since 2013. Now, the U.S. does not formally recognize Maduro as the head of state and hasn't for years. Maduro was charged with narco-terrorism and corruption back in 2020, and there was a reward for $50 million for his arrest. Now, the State Department warned U.S. citizens in Venezuela to shelter in place this morning, and the U.S. Embassy in Colombia is warning Americans not to travel to Venezuela. For more, let's go to Lilia Luciano, who joins us from the Dominican Republic. Lilia, good morning.
Good morning to you, Michael. The situation in Venezuela right now could turn very volatile. I have been hearing reports from people who are truly afraid that any expression of support or even sharing the videos of these strikes that they themselves documented could make them a target of the regime. So far, since these strikes took place, we have heard from the Minister of Defense in Venezuela, who declared a state of emergency, a state of exception. He said that every military force in Venezuela will be deployed across the land. At the same time, he's calling for people to not fall into anarchy or chaos. The Minister of, it's an odd name, but a popular Minister of Justice, basically the de facto second or third most powerful person in Venezuela, Diosdado Cabello, also spoke out and called for calm. But people in Venezuela who have been under this regime for decades understand that at a moment like this, any expression of support for the actions of the United States could be very dangerous. That's why that message is going out to U.S. or even, or other ally citizens in the country to be very careful. I have interviewed people very recently who are allied and supportive of the regime, and they say we are willing to fight. We're willing to give up our lives if we have to support this regime. There may be an expectation that because there is an opposition that won an election last year, according to the voter tallies that they presented, to the evidence that they presented, and have been acknowledged by the international community as the legitimate government of Venezuela, that doesn't mean that this will be an easy transition. There are armed groups, there are armed guerrillas, and the government of Colombia, I spoke yesterday with the Minister of Defense of Colombia, which is, borders Venezuela. The government of Colombia is deploying their military to the border to both deal with any possible migration crisis that could emerge now after what happened last night because of the bombings or the taking of Maduro, or because they fear that those armed groups, the armed guerrillas, in particular the ELN from Colombia, which has been historically allied with forces in Venezuela, could retaliate. So it's a very dynamic situation. The opposition has not wanted to say anything. They have not responded to my request for comment yet. I assume they're waiting to hear from President Trump. But it's moving fast.
It is indeed. Lilia Luciano, thank you so much for your reporting. I've been following it all. CBS News national security contributor Samantha Vinograd joins us now. She served as former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. Sam, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. So how precedented is a move like this from the U.S., and should Congress have been involved in the decision to do it?
Well, the Trump administration has said for several months that they don't need congressional authority to engage in military strikes against alleged drug smugglers. They have cited the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army and Navy under Article 2 of the Constitution, whereas many others have cited Article 1 of the Constitution and Congress's inherent responsibility to declare war. So that's a legal issue that's outstanding. But at the same time, Congress will be responsible, of course, for approving any funds that will be needed for further deployments in and around Venezuela and any stabilization needs on the ground, not to mention the precedent of a president invading another country, engaging in these strikes, and exfiltrating a foreign leader absent congressional authority. That's a checks and balances issue with serious repercussions going forward. There is precedent. Back in the 80s, the United States, for example, did capture via Delta forces the leader of Panama and bring him back to the United States to stand trial. So there is some precedent there, Adriana.
Well, Sam, Utah Senator Mike Lee says Secretary of State Marco Rubio expects no further action in Venezuela now that Maduro is in custody. But even if the White House is saying this is over, how will Venezuela react to this? And should Americans be concerned about possible escalation or retaliation?
Well, I don't think there will be one reaction by Venezuela. Venezuelans are not a monolithic entity. Instead, what we have to wait and see, and what we just don't know, is whether there have been any conversations through covert channels, for example, with members of Maduro loyalists to talk to them about de-escalation and leaving power, and or any conversations with opposition leaders about stepping in to run the country. Under the Venezuelan constitution, ostensibly the vice president should take over. But what we don't know, again, if there have been discussions about who is going to run Venezuela now that Maduro is gone, whether with Maduro loyalists, with the opposition, and or with neighboring countries like Colombia, like others, who could be critical in helping to instill a sense of calm and stabilization in an incredibly chaotic situation.
And Sam, what was your reaction when you saw the news that Maduro was in custody? And if you could imagine, what it was like behind the scenes, how complex is an operation like this?
Well, I think certainly many breathed a sigh of relief that Maduro's reign of human rights abuses, democratic backsliding, narcotics trafficking, and more are over. At the same time, this was an incredibly complicated military operation, likely with a broad range of military assets backed up by seriously good intelligence on Maduro's whereabouts. So kudos to the folks that pulled it off. But it is truly mind-boggling that the United States launched this operation in Venezuela without congressional authorization, without a UN Security Council resolution. And that does open up a Pandora's box when it comes to precedent going forward. So while Maduro was an illegitimate leader doing very bad things, this was an unprecedented operation, and without the right follow-through could lead to a more chaotic situation than currently exists.
And Sam, where do you think that the U.S. would take Maduro?
They could take him a number of places, Adriana. I think that ultimately the goal is to have him stand trial in the United States. He was indicted in 2020 on a range of narcotics and other charges. But behind the scenes, ostensibly, there's a law enforcement angle to this, where to take Maduro, where to have him stand trial. Certainly what government will be functioning today now that Maduro is no longer there. And further, what happens to Venezuela's vast resources, its oil, its gold, its mineral deposits, and other matters. And so those behind the scenes conversations, that wargaming, Adriana, not the military side, but the stabilization side, oftentimes accompanies the discussions and the wargaming on the actual military operation. We just don't know what's happened in that regard. And we hope to hear more about that from the president this morning.
All right, Sam Vinograd, thanks so much for joining us. And we want to turn now to Ed O'Keefe, our senior White House and political correspondent. He is in our Washington newsroom. Ed, I know you've been talking with your White House sources all morning. What are you hearing in Washington?
Well, Michael, just keep in mind, the president has been saying for months that this kind of attack or operation inside Venezuela was possible. And we know, or CBS News has learned, that the president had given the green light to conduct land strikes in Venezuela at some point here in recent days before this actual operation occurred. Part of the issue in recent days has been the weather. There was authority to do this as early as Christmas Day, but there were actually U.S. military operations that day against ISIS targets in Nigeria, and so the focus shifted to that and then back to Venezuela. And for several days now, there have been concerns about the weather, and now we understand why. It was if it was that they had to go in and capture Maduro and his wife and bring them out, then perhaps, yes, you needed clear skies and favorable weather conditions to do that. And so that gives you a sense of how long the White House and the Pentagon have been preparing for this. What's telling, too, is the fact that he says here law enforcement operations or law enforcement was involved. As you've been discussing with Sam and Natalie and Lilia, the idea now that he would be brought to the United States to face the charges he was indicted on back in 2020 mirrors what happened 35 years ago today, when the Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega was arrested in Panama and brought to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. Maduro faces similar ones, and should it go similar to the way it did for Noriega, then Maduro would face charges here. You know, could be found guilty, serve time here in the United States while a new political process plays out in Venezuela. And we'll hear later whether that's exactly what the president wants, and if indeed, as Secretary Rubio is apparently telling Republican lawmakers this morning, the military aspect of this is over.
So, Ed, some lawmakers in Congress have been in support of this. Others on both sides of the aisle are concerned about whether it's legal. What political ramifications might this have for the president, both in Congress and among the American public?
Well, we've been polling this, Adriana, for several months now, and it's telling how deeply skeptical the country is about this across partisan lines. Consider 73% said in a CBS News poll just last month the president needs to explain what's going on in Venezuela. When we asked about it in November, 70% said they'd oppose military action against the country. 3/4 said the administration hadn't clearly explained why military action is necessary. And 3 in 4 said the president would need congressional approval before taking military action in Venezuela, including a majority of Republicans, which is why you saw this morning several of them on social media at least express concerns about this. But we're also seeing the Secretary of State calling around to some of his former Republican colleagues in the Senate, at least, Mike Lee, Tom Cotton, head of the Intelligence Committee, to say, this is why we did it. This is why we believe it was legal or constitutional. We'll see whether they stand by them in the coming hours, depending on what the president says later.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much.